Building. I'm Juliet Wade, and today we're talking about titles. And this is not titles of books, this is titles of people. So we're talking about honorific titles, other kinds of titles, why you would stick another word in front of somebody's name or another thing after somebody's name, and all of that. Because people do it a lot in real life, and they do it a lot in fiction, and we should sort of dive into that a little bit. So that's the plan. I was just tutoring yesterday. I have a young fellow at my kids' school who I tutor in Japanese. And one of the things that we were doing yesterday was we were talking about what san means. And it's something that many Americans know exists, but they don't necessarily know exactly how it works. And so one of the things that I was explaining about it is that you stick san on the end of somebody's name to indicate respect for them. It's a little bit like calling somebody Mr. or Ms. or, that kind of thing. But there's some fun little wrinkles to it. So san, you could put on somebody's last name. You can put it actually even on their first name. Or you can put it on their profession. So, for example, if you want to refer to the lady who runs the noodle shop down the street and you don't know her name, you can call her Udonya-san, which is noodle shop san. So it's not just on names. Anyway, but it does indicate that you are talking to or about a person and attempting to do so in a respectful manner. And then there's chan, and chan is a diminutive, and it goes on names, and it can go, it's usually for little kids, and people mostly think of it as being applicable to young ladies, but that's not all it can do, depending on the context. It can also, we have a grown male friend in Osaka who goes by Yachan among his family, right? But that's basically his first name, Yasuo, shortened and then added chan to, Yachan. So, we think we know that what chan is up to, but it's not up to necessarily the things that we think it's up to. And I think that's one of the things that we kind of have to watch out for when we're looking for titles and stuff like that, at least when we're dealing with ones in the real world. You want to make sure that you're doing enough research that you can understand that if there are funny wrinkles about how this is used in context, that you're finding out about it. Because you don't want to stick it on something and be wrong. And the only other one that I want to mention right now from Japanese is sensei, which people are often familiar with from martial arts teachers and that kind of thing. And it's used for teachers, but it's also used for doctors and dentists and artists, and basically, we used it for people. Yeah, it's people who have mastery of something. It literally means somebody who was born before or lived before, and so when we were in a shop in Kyushu, and we discovered that the lady who was showing us around the shop was actually the woman who had made a good deal of the pottery that we were looking at. We started calling her Sensei, and she loved it. Right? And one final note on those. they're suffixes. So you don't want to call somebody Sensei Wade or Sensei so-and-so, because that is reversing things and you wouldn't want to do that. So it's a suffix that goes on the person's name. So, okay, so that's one example. In English, we have the gendered and socially fraught terms, Mr., Mrs., and Ms., and Miss. Yeah. And then we also have Sir, which is an odd one.
Ma'am.
What? Oh, there's Jay.
Ma'am.
Oh, and then ma'am. That's right.
Yeah.
Have you ever hated?
Oh my gosh, whenever I get called ma'am, I kind of go, excuse me?
Because it implies age?
You know, maybe. It just seems odd to me.
Yeah.
I'd rather be called excuse me than ma'am.
And then there's excuse me, ma'am.
Yeah, well, there it is, yeah. But ma'am always gives me a weird feeling. I don't know if it's a
In
reason.
some contexts in the South, honey is almost verging into ma'am, more of a
Something you can call somebody if you don't know who they are?
yeah.
Okay, so I think, yeah.
Like older waitresses in a Southern diner will call the customers honey. That kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that you've pointed out something really interesting, because there are a couple of different things going on here, right? I don't think that things you call people when you don't know their names are quite the same as titles, but it's worth making a nod to them. We will nod to them.
Yeah.
Because we use sir for that and ma'am. In Japan, people typically use family terms. Like elder sister or aunt or grandmother, depending on the gender and age or perceived age of the person. And of course, they'll tend to round down. You don't want to be calling somebody grandma unless they look like they're quite elderly. But, right? But yeah, so you have these instances where, and it's not just Japan either, where you'll have if you don't know somebody's name, you'll call them by a family kin term. But I think, yeah, so yeah. Anyway, okay, great. Titles can also be things associated with your profession, right?
Doctor.
Yep.
Predominantly.
Doctor, and we apply doctor in some similar ways to the way that we apply, or to the way that they apply sensei in Japan, but not all the same ways. So we call our dentists doctor. We don't call our dentists dentist.
But it's like that has to do with like your degrees, your diplomas. So
True.
It's more like how you've gotten it. Is you've gone through like X amount of schooling and you have these degrees, because there's also like vets are also doctors because they have a doctorate of veterinary medicine. So
right. And PhDs.
Yeah, are also doctors, but they can't like operate on you.
Have the option of
interesting. A law degree is basically a doctorate, but the lawyers don't use the word doctor.
Yeah.
And the reason I know that is I have a relative who has a law degree and is now in academia. And so people call him Dr. blah, blah, blah.
Oh, that's interesting.
And he's mentioned how odd it sounded to him at first.
Juris Doctorate? or something along those lines.
Yeah, a JD is a doctorate.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. But, my husband is Dr. Smith. Let's not even go that far back. But he doesn't use that. He's not an academic, and most people, I think, don't even know it. So.
Well, most people don't know that I'm a doctor.
That's true. I did not know.
No, I did not know
it
either.
Makes sense.
Wow.
And sometimes you look and you say, is that really possible? Could you possibly have done all that? But that's also partly an age perception thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's an interesting question with whether you're going to use the title is actually an interesting question, and not one that I want to spend a ton of time on. But using a title has a social distancing effect, right? Because it says, I am due certain types of autonomic respect from you, blah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right? I mean,
yeah, because there's like people who insist on using Dr. blah blah blah.
Yeah.
And then there are people who like do it, I think, for like I think there's a difference there because like men will drop a woman's title faster than they will drop a man's title.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then if they drop a man's title, it's for disrespect. If they drop a woman's title, it's because they don't care.
Yeah, well,
disrespectful.
So it's a tool, right? It's a linguistic tool for conveying certain types of things. So whether you drop the title can mean different things depending on context.
It can also mean something different if you add the title. If you are accustomed to just using somebody's first name, and then they annoy you or they do something that requires a distance. When I was in school, everybody used first names, faculty, students, staff.
Right.
And the guy who's in charge of the motor pool, first name, and after he sent me out in a car that had failed inspection with a whole bunch of students in the car, I went back and I addressed him as Mr. And at that point, he knew.
He was in trouble.
He knew. Akin maybe to using your child's middle name, except that I was talking to an adult, so
yeah, right.
Different. Using your authority versus using the authority. Making it clear that I was using his professional position.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just definitely knew I was
ticked with it. Part of it is when you use the title, you're indicating that it's almost like you're setting the social context for the interaction, right? So I will now be addressing you in your professional capacity, as opposed to
I'm personally annoyed with you.
You're some guy.
Right.
Right? I mean, so for example, my choice not to go by Dr. Wade is very studied. Like I think if I were to go around being Dr. Wade all the time, that I wouldn't have as many friends as I have. Because I remember I had a substitute teacher who always insisted on being called Dr. I think his name was Dr. Hahn or something, and everybody just thought he was the most pretentious. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, like, we never heard what his doctorate was about, right? It wasn't a topic that he wanted to discuss, which might have made it more interesting, right? He just wanted to make sure we knew that he was due respect. Now, this could have been because he was a substitute teacher, and that can be hard to come by, but I don't think using the title was actually helping him in that context. So I use it when it's relevant. Like we had this big issue recently with our school district, and it's still ongoing. The school district is messing a bunch of stuff up in my area. But anyway, so we went out to complain and to register our protest at the school board meeting. And I stood up there and I said, you know, I'm Julia Wade, PhD. You know, I have a PhD in education, and you should be listening to me about your plans for the education of the children in our area. You know. So yeah, so you know, that was on purpose. But it's not the kind of thing that I like to do unless there's a very specific reason for it.
Yeah.
Right.
No, so there's that. Then we haven't touched on. I guess let's segue through that question that Shay wrote down, which is how you get titles.
Right.
Some titles people just give you by virtue of your age, or you know, your identity, or your membership in a social group, right? Some of them have to be awarded by particular organizations, right? Sir, for example, has to come from the king or queen.
Yeah.
Right?
Likewise, dame.
Sorry?
Likewise, dame.
Yeah.
Yes. Sir or dame. I will make sure to include dame. Thank you for mentioning it. You know, things like king or queen, those are titles.
Yeah.
Titles, baron, count.
Right. Anything like baron.
Yeah.
Count.
And then there's and those titles also have, you don't address people necessarily as baron so-and-so, but there's this whole hierarchy of how you address them formally and somewhat informally, and
well, it's who do you call your highness and who do you call your majesty, and
there's a whole thing for that. We need some Ren Fair people. They would know all of it.
Yeah.
Well, it's complicated. I mean, right? I mean, there's a difference between what you call somebody to their face and what you call them when you're talking about them. Right? Yeah, titles by marriage. So Mrs. is a title that you get through marriage. I wanted to make a statement about this, which is there are certain people who are licensed to give out titles of particular types, right? There is somebody who is licensed to crown you as the king or queen, right? You can, I think, become princess or prince just by birth into the right family.
Yeah.
But to become king or queen, you have to be crowned, and that has to be done by a particular person. I believe it's in England. I believe it's the Archbishop of Canterbury. Am I right?
That sounds right, because it came through in Europe, wasn't it? Because the title was God-given and therefore had to be done through the church.
Right.
And it's sort of you sort of had to have certain amounts of backing, and then how close in line you were, and all sorts of tons of stuff went into actually making somebody king queen, because it wasn't just it wasn't just the Archbishop could pick anybody they wanted.
No, absolutely, and there are all kinds of conditions that have to be met, right? But there's also a particular person who has to award it to you.
Yeah.
But let's also remember, we're mostly talking about English royalty and nobility. Sometimes even the other European countries.
Yeah.
The details vary.
Right. And details will vary. And in fact, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to mention it, because in a secondary world, it's useful to know how the person gets the title, right?
Yeah.
Because it can vary in a lot of ways. I mean, it's not always hereditary, and even when it is hereditary, sometimes you have to have a particular ceremony happen before you're actually official.
Yeah.
Coronation.
And those kinds of details can have a lot to do with plot.
Yeah.
If you miss your coronation, your younger sibling gets it. I don't know.
Well, I mean, yeah, I don't, the powers that you have to command and or get stuff done may differ depending on whether you've been crowned or not. It's,
Yeah.
So have you guys invented any titles?
Yes. That was, by which I mean, wow, that was, how did I get that? Where did they come from, and how do I make them match? A very simple system, too. What's the title for the ruler? What's the title for the ruler's spouse? For the heir to the rulership, the other siblings? How do you indicate that somebody is part of the family but not in line of succession?
Right.
And that's just those titles. I've been trying to figure out, the equivalent of ma'am, which is basically a term of respect from a younger person to an older person of either particular position, if you know that, or marital status, which I would like to have be mostly irrelevant except in marital context.
Yeah.
But it had to be, you come up with those terms, and it says, it can tell you a little bit about what you think the relationships are between the people.
Right.
If you say, okay. And that was, once I came up with one term, then relating them in terms of linguistically, I could just say, okay, these are similar in sound. And they sound like they come from the same word.
Did you make up words for these titles, Morgan?
I did. The head of the house and the head of the ruling house is Sesh. So it's the first name and then the title, Sesh, and then the house name. And I should find that. Seshet, I think, is what I'm used for the spouse of the, yeah, there it is. For the spouse of the Sesh, of the leader. And the heir is Sena, and then Senayet, Sarah and Seret. Sena being the heir, and Sarah being any other children. And then I came up with what spouses are called as a group, regardless of their rank. So they are all of a group, regardless of their rank, and the spouse is not the primary heir.
Right.
To the I want to say throne, but there's no throne.
I hear you.
Yeah.
There's no name for they have no name for the ruler of the country. They don't have a term like king, and that's the thing that I'm missing. Except that this is the occupying, the invading society, invading culture. So they have their terms, but shoot, the other people don't have a word for king either. Yeah, this is tricky, but I'm looking for something that you can use to say.
Well, so let's. May I digress just briefly? Because I think you're into something that's kind of interesting. I like the way you talk in terms of ruler, ruler, spouse, heir, right? That kind of thing. It seems to me that your suffix that you've created, which is et, is actually indicative of a marriage relationship, but not indicative of gender. Am I correct?
Right. Yes.
Okay, great. Because that is very interesting. It's an interesting choice. So when you're coming up with this stuff, there are things that you can take into account. Gender is one, marital relationships is another. One of the things that's very important to keep in mind is if you're going to use English-style titles, they're going to imply certain sorts of things about the world. And that's a bit of a minefield, which is why when you're wanting to really work from the ground up, it's often a good idea to make up a word, right? Because king means something very, very, very specific in our world.
Yeah.
And monarchies of various varieties have been extremely common through all kinds of fantasy and let's see, kings. I guess there are kings in science fiction also, but my mind immediately goes to fantasy. So
yeah,
that's it's a word with strong associations, right? You know, if you were to use the word mayor,
right,
that's another word that has very strong associations, right?
Well, that has sort of a specific definition too. A mayor is somebody who's in charge of a city, and it's for male or female. There isn't like a mayoress.
Right.
The mayor.
But so depending on the context in the fictional world, you may or may not feel like using mayor is a good idea. Because, okay, so take my example, right? I have, in Varan, there are only 8 cities. And nobody lives outside the cities. So to call the heads of the cities mayor would have the wrong feel, because in a way they're more like governors. Because each city is the only thing in its state, right?
Right. City states.
So I didn't want to use mayor, and I didn't want to use governor either, because that implied a certain kind of jurisdiction over smaller local organizations. So I made up my own term, right? But it was because I was worried about the possible implications that I made up the word, and it's just, you know, a word that I made up in the language of Varan, which is Alexi, which basically means firstmost, right? But it has to do with, yes, it has to do with what's implied, what kinds of things are implied. You know, where does your authority extend as a mayor versus a governor, etc.
Yeah, and like in the U.S., we have very, you know, set definitions because there's this whole government structure that's already in place. So, you know, there's like, you know, so we know what the expectations and jurisdictions are.
So, another one that has a lot of interesting implications is let's say military titles.
Rank, yeah.
Yeah, military rank.
From one service to the other. There are titles in the Navy that don't exist in the Army or in the Air Force.
And titles in the Navy that are the same as a title in the Army and Air Force, but are very different rank.
Yeah, those are like, some of those I think are is because like which one came first, like technologically, sort of. Like, okay, like the U.S., like the Army Rangers or something were like, started out, they were like horse cavalry. And then of course horses were obsolete, so, but like, I think the titles stayed, but like, you put this, like, the technology is completely different now.
Yeah. Well, the titles tend to stay the same while the world changes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's interesting. That's actually an interesting point. Titles are conservative. And so they will tend to take on additional significance because the world has changed. But they also tend to, because they're conservative, they also reference a sort of authority of the past, right?
Yeah.
Which is an interesting wrinkle.
Yeah. Like, people still use Mr. and Mrs. like they did 50 years ago or 100 years ago.
Right, right.
Ms. is a recent artificial construct, though.
Ms?
Ms.
Ms.
Yeah.
Yes. Ms. is different.
Yeah, and that was based on a need a demand for a term with which to address women without basing their
unmarried
position
women
on their marital status.
Yeah.
And now some people are pushing for MX to be gender neutral.
Yeah, but I don't know
how do you pronounce that.
I don't know how to pronounce it.
Yeah, exactly. They're like, things have to be pronounceable.
Yeah.
I saw somewhere how to pronounce it. I just don't remember where.
Mix?
It was probably in one of the
Mix.
Mix.
I think so.
Oh.
Well, that would be my first guess.
But then that's just like, but then there's already the word mix, like you're mixing something. So that seems kind of confusing.
So that's a sort of associative, added possible implication. I wanted to mention something that I did in the Varn world with the cast names.
Mm-hmm.
Because the cast names actually started out as titles. So it was a long-term historical plan, let's just say. So you have people who have names and they have first and last names, and at a certain point they decide to institute this system by which you would indicate your vocation of a particular variety, right? And the last names of particular people who were indicative of the virtues of that vocation were chosen as the titles deliberately. So that if you were a part of that title, you would go by title plus first name plus last name. And then over time it changed and people started not using the last names as much anymore. Because basically what happened over time was the title turned into a name. And so it was almost like everybody in the same cast has the same last name, except that it's not your last name, it's actually your first name. Because it comes first, because it used to be a title. And so the cast names are actually used if you don't know if you don't know a person's name, you call them by their caste name because their caste is marked legally. They have to be. And so if they're not marked, that means they must be noble, because those are the only people who don't have a particular legislated mark. And then for everybody else, right, for everybody else, you call them by whatever their title is.
So do you
dropping
always
off of the last name is a little bit more of a stretch than some of the other things, but it works for me.
Do you always the last a profession then or a caste? Because do you always know a person's caste or profession?
Yes.
Okay.
You so basically within the context of Varan, you are required to wear a mark that tells what your caste is.
Literally a marked state.
It is a marked state. The only people who are unmarked are actually the nobility. Now, obviously, it would be possible to go outside unmarked, but you might get fined.
Yeah.
Right? Or people might just not want to interact with you because they don't know how. Right? Because their expectations are not set. I mean, that's one of the things that titles do, is they set expectations for the type of interaction that's going to follow. We've already established that with some of our earlier discussion. So that's one of the problems of being unmarked in the foreign world. Every caste has a different mark. They're not all clothes or whatever. One caste has tattoos. One caste has a color that they wear, that they have to wear somewhere on them. One caste has a belt. Another caste has a particular color of jacket. So they've all got something a little different, because I didn't want them all to be really uniform. I wanted them to be a little more indicative of what kind of, like, what the particular vocation was. So anyway, yeah. So I don't want to go deeper into that, because that's, foreign stuff.
Yeah.
But the point being that that these are titles at the same time that they're last names, or surnames, as I suppose you would call it, because they come first in the order. But
a point at which Joe Baker really was a baker.
Right. They're larger categories, though. They're like, I am an artisan.
Yeah.
Or someone who works with knowledge, or I am a merchant, or the baker is probably a merchant.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm a person who is a laborer, right? And I'm either raising mushrooms, or raising silk spiders, or farming, or mining, or this, but they would all have the same title.
Right.
Yeah.
Because, after all, the more titles you have, the more work you have to do. In the military titles, though, one of the things that I ran into was that a lot of military titles come from French. Right? So, like, lieutenant
right.
Is from French, and sergeant is from French, and captain is Latin, I think, in the end. But it also exists in French.
Yeah.
But when I was working with, like, foreign military, so let's say that you're working with a secondary world military situation, and there's no relation between your world and French. Are you going to want to use those very French-inspired military terms? Well, possibly.
A lot of people do use them.
Sure.
I see them a lot still, like in fantasy, like you get Captain of the Guard or whatever, because I think it's because people sort of automatically recognize the rank, and you don't really have to explain it.
So if the system is same, the system
is very similar, right?
Yeah.
So there's no harm. It's like calling your rabbit-like creature that we were talking about in another dive, calling it a rabbit because that's the place that it takes in the world. So, a captain takes a captain's place, you might as well.
Now, I think, like, I haven't seen too many, like, I think, like, the Roman ranks had different, like, legionnaire and stuff, and
like decurion and centurion and that sort of thing.
Yeah, you don't see those quite so much, but I think it would be interesting to pull in from, like, titles from, like, another ancient culture's military and then use it in fantasy. I haven't seen that done too much. People generally just go for the regular rank of, you know, what like whatever is current, sort of, or like technologically, or like, you know, the English/French sergeant, captain, lieutenant. Everybody kind of uses those.
Well, so for example, like in ancillary justice, you have lieutenants. And you have captains, and the captains are ship captains. And the lieutenants are military leaders on the ship. And it's I don't think it's ever explicitly spelled out anywhere in those books. But it's enough to orient you. And that's actually one thing that I wanted to mention, is that you can use a term that's familiar as a sort of an anchor, and then work off of that. So like so in the Varan system, which is quite different from our military system, you have captains, because everybody knows what a captain is, right? Yeah. And it's less explicitly French sounding. It's something that's been used across so many contexts that people are like, oh yeah, I know what a captain is. Okay. Yeah. So I use captain because of that, and the other thing I use is commander. And commander is a higher rank than captain in my system. I mean, I suppose you could potentially do it another way, but so that was my choice. But then I was like, okay, well, how do you rank relative to that, right? And so what I decided was that you have commander, and then you have captain, and then under captain you have captain's hand. Okay, because captain's hand indicates that you're underneath the captain.
But that you're also sort of like the very next in the chain of command.
Right, precisely. So then you have, under the captain's hands, then you have the cohorts, and each cohort has 8 people, and so the person who leads the cohort is the cohort first. Right? And so you might have a rank of first, or 8th, if you're, you know. And if you're 8th, that means you have to do what everybody else says. But yeah, so each cohort has 1 through 8, and then each of the firsts reports to a captain's hand, and then each of the captain's hands reports to a captain, and each of the captains reports to the commander. So you can make a system that will make sense, but it helps to have some anchor terms in there to give people a, oh my God, I don't know, like save them from like dumping them in there and having them go, I know nothing about this. Yeah. Giving them some hint is valuable. So.
Well, that's always the thing. I mean, anytime you're writing fantasy or most science fiction, there's a presumption that everything's being translated into English for the benefit of the reader.
Right, right.
So if a word really isn't significantly different from the English equivalent, like a captain, like you say, if you don't need to know how a Varan captain is different from an American captain,
right? Exactly.
Then call it a captain.
Call it a captain, so people kind of know what's up. And then let them figure out the rest by just experience. Yeah, exactly. But I think
a cohort is also a military term too. So
a cohort is,
So you know, but it's not one that you see all the time. So it's
right. Yeah. And so if you're trying to get away from a big set of natural implications, like say those associated with the word gang, right? You're gonna want to look around and see if you can find things that are a little different, so that you can kind of, it's almost like what you're doing by choosing an unusual term is you are deliberately saying to a reader, I went out of my way to choose this different term for a reason. You better be on the lookout for what's different. That's exact. I mean, so that is the implication of choosing an unusual term.
Yeah.
Your
it also
assumption
sort of,
may
you know,
not apply.
separates it nicely from the real world.
Right.
You know, so like, oh, you know, this is this fantasy thing that, you know, is different, that, you know.
Yeah.
So there's a person, you know, a personal valet, right? It's to, you know, specifically to a lord or an earl or a head of house or some wealthy person. But you don't need a special word for that if it's going to be the same term as personal valet. But what I've called them is a hand.
Yeah.
So if you've got, in the context of someone working within the house, then you can say, okay, this is like that. Whereas if you've got them working outside the house, then you might go more towards, okay, the person is the right-hand man.
Yeah.
It's a non-military term.
Yeah.
Of course, that's bringing to me I guess from the military context, the difference between staff and line. If like you say, a valet is someone's hand, he's not his second in command. He doesn't have the authority to tell other people what to do. He's a personal servant, and that's staff.
Yeah.
Whereas as in Juliet's context of the captain's hand, that's line of command. That's specifically.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thanks for pointing that out, Linda. Good.
There are rank and title within like those sort of moneyed households. Butler, under butler, footman, housekeeper, parlor maid, scullery maid, maid cook. You know, so there was a whole sort of staff hierarchy for servants in wealthy homes. And personal valet would have been among them, and then the equivalent of the valet would have been for the man of the house, and the woman of the house would have had like a special lady's maid, dresser and hairdresser, and even sort of companion, and she would have had a fair amount of power. But possibly not as much as the housekeeper, the head housekeeper, who was in charge of all the servants. And the house.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, people have a tendency to like to rank one another and categorize one another. We can't.
Well, yeah, I mean we're hierarchical animals.
Yeah.
You know.
So we're getting towards the end of our hour. I know we always start late, but until Google starts to help us out here a little, it's just the way that this show works. Anyway, any last thoughts, things that you came to the Hangout with that you think we did not touch on?
Clashes between cultures, because Kanahar would have had their own language and their own culture, so the people living there before they were taken over by the different culture with a different set of titles. You know, so Marcus is saying yes ma'am and no ma'am and that sort of thing, but those aren't the words that the now the culture that's now in charge, that's now leading the country, would use. So, you know, does he use those?
One of the first things like an invader would do is insist you use the proper titles.
Yeah. Well, you know, a really good example of this is actually Anne Leckie's ancillary books, because she's got the Rodchai Empire that comes, you know, hurtling in from outer space, totally takes over your planet, and all of a sudden the only title that you're due is the title Radchai, which means citizen, right? Mm-hmm. And all previous ranks are wiped away, except you've got a few people, such as High Priest of such and such, who will retain their titles, because the Radchai Empire recognizes that they have a certain degree of sway over the population, and so they want to make sure that this person is treated well and continues to hold sway so that people don't get upset and get themselves killed, because, you know, that's pretty much all rebellion shall be squashed by we will kill you.
Yeah.
Right.
But I think it's actually really interesting, and one of the things that she deals with in the books is that even though you've ostensibly erased all this stuff, you really haven't erased all this stuff.
Yeah.
Right?
But people are still going to be made to use the Conqueror's titles.
Right, exactly.
In a lot of ways. So it's like, yeah. Because they're going to insist on it, and if you keep using the wrong title, they're going to keep correcting you, and then that correction might be more punitive as time goes on. So you're going to kind of learn pretty quickly to just use whatever the hell they're telling you to use.
Well, at least in a public context.
Yeah. And especially when addressing the Conqueror, too. You're going to have to use their titles.
Right. Well, very interesting, you guys. Thank you for this. This was really fun. Next week, we are meeting Wednesday at 10, same bat time, same bat channel. And we are going to be talking with Nancy Hightower about her new poetry collection. This should be interesting. I haven't talked about poetry on the show before, so I'm really looking forward to this. So Nancy Hightower is going to be here next week, and that will be something to look forward to. I might have kids in the house, but that's okay. As it will be
Your
better
kids are getting bigger.
But yeah, they get bigger all the time.
All right. And sometimes very suddenly.
Yeah, well, sometimes. All right, thanks you guys for being here. I'm going to stop the broadcast.
Okay.